The glowing red numbers on my alarm clock read Muri High, Muri Bay, AM, February Muri Bonth. I don't care who you are or how old you get. A phone ringing past midnight never brings good news. I reached for it, my Samui Bay-year-old joints protesting against the winter chill seeping through the Philadelphia windows. When I saw the caller ID, my stomach instantly tied itself into a heavy, cold knot. It was Patrick, my son, and a senior agent in the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Patrick was a man who lived his life by rules, schedules, and protocols. He didn't call just to chat, and he certainly didn't call at 12:15 on a Tuesday. "Patrick," I answered, keeping my voice low so as not to wake the rest of the house. "Is everything okay with the kids?" "Dad, listen to me very carefully." Patrick's voice was breathless, tight, vibrating, with an urgency I hadn't heard since he was a teenager who'd just totaled his first car. "Do not turn on any lights, roll out of bed right now, lock your bedroom door, and get down to your basement workshop." "Patrick, you're terrifying me. What's going on?" "Don't ask questions, Dad. Just do it. And whatever you do not let Daniel hear you." The line went dead. I sat there in the pitch black, the phone clutched in my trembling, calloused hand. For 38 years, I worked as an arson investigator for the Philadelphia Fire Department. I've walked into the charred, smoking skeletons of warehouses, apartment complexes, and family homes. I know what a flashover feels like right before it happens. The air gets thin, the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, the silence becomes so heavy it practically suffocates you. That is exactly what the air in my own bedroom felt like right then. I didn't know it yet, but the fire in my life had been burning for almost a year. It hadn't started with a match or a pool of gasoline. It started out invisible, smoldering quietly inside the walls of my own family, waiting for the perfect moment to consume me entirely. To understand how I ended up hiding like a rat in my own home, you need to understand the accelerants that were poured into my life. Her name is Jessica, my daughter, 42 years old, with her mother's green eyes and what I always believed was my strong moral compass. After my wife, Helen, passed away from breast cancer 5 years ago, Jessica became my anchor. She was the girl who used to sit on my basement workbench when she was 8, kicking her legs and handing me tiny brass screws while I restored antique clocks. She used to call me her hero. Then, 3 years ago, Daniel Harris walked into her life. Daniel called himself a wealth management consultant. He wore tailored Italian suits, drove a leased Audi. He treated better than his own wife, and had a smile that was perfectly practiced but never quite reached his eyes. He was a smooth talker, the kind of guy who could sell a drowning man a glass of water. When they got married, I paid for the lavish country club wedding because I wanted my little girl to be happy. I wanted to believe she was safe. That was my first, catastrophic mistake. Last February, Jessica came to me with tears in her eyes. Their luxury apartment building was being sold, their lease was terminated, and Daniel was supposedly between massive investment projects. "Just temporarily, Dad." Jessica had pleaded over coffee at my kitchen table, squeezing my hand with those soft, manicured fingers. "We want to move in with you, just for a few months until Daniel's new fund closes. Plus, you're getting older. It scares me, you living in this massive house, all alone. We could help look after you." I should have said no. I should have trusted my gut, the same razor-sharp instinct that kept me from stepping through weakened floorboards in countless blazing buildings. Instead, I looked at my daughter, saw the ghost of my late wife in her smile, and said yes. Look after you. That phrase quickly became my prison. The first week they moved in, Daniel installed high-end, motion-activated security cameras in the hallways, the kitchen, and the living room. "For your peace of mind, Chester," he'd said, flashing those blinding white veneers. "Can't be too careful with home invasions these days." But I'm not an idiot. I noticed the blind spots. There were no cameras in their master bedroom, and no cameras in my basement clock restoration workshop. Interesting choices for someone who was supposedly so worried about a break-in. Then came the psychological isolation. My old buddies from the firehouse used to come over for poker on Thursday nights. Suddenly, they stopped calling. When I finally ran into my old captain at the hardware store, he looked at me with pity. Daniel said, "Your memory was slipping, Chess. Said the noise of the poker games was making you agitated and confused. We didn't want to stress you out." Confused? My mind was a steel trap. But Daniel had been systematically building a narrative to everyone on the outside that I was losing my marbles. He started moving my car keys and putting them in the refrigerator. He would hide my mail, and then helpfully find it in the trash can, looking at Jessica with a sad, knowing sigh. But the most terrifying part was the tea. For the past 3 months, Daniel had insisted on making me a special, expensive herbal tea every night before bed. My holistic doctor swears by this for joint pain, Chester. He'd insist, standing over me until I drained the mug. Lately, I'd been waking up incredibly groggy. I was missing chunks of time in the mornings. My hands, which had spent decades doing precision repairs on 10th century pocket watches, had started to shake. I genuinely thought I was failing. I thought the shadow of dementia was finally swallowing me whole. But what happened next changed absolutely everything. Tonight, for the first time in 90 days, I hadn't drank Daniel's tea. My stomach had been sour from a bad piece of fish at lunch. So when Daniel left the mug on my nightstand and went to take a shower, I quietly poured the lukewarm liquid down the bathroom sink. Because I poured that tea away, my mind was crystal clear when Patrick's midnight call came through. And because my mind was clear, I didn't hesitate. I trusted my son. I slipped out of bed, the hardwood floor freezing against my bare feet. I didn't grab a weapon. I didn't turn on a lamp. I moved through my own home like a shadow, avoiding the second and fourth steps on the staircase because I knew they groaned under weight. As I crept past the master bedroom where Jessica and Daniel slept, I froze. The bedroom door was cracked open. The moonlight from the window illuminated the bed. It was completely empty. A cold spike of pure adrenaline pierced my chest. Where was my daughter? I didn't stop to investigate. I descended into the basement and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me, engaging the deadbolt silently. My workshop smelled of brass polish, machine oil, and old, damp wood. 23 antique clocks ticked in perfect unison around me. It was a chorus of tiny metallic heartbeats, masking the sound of my own ragged, terrified breathing. I crouched behind my massive wooden workbench, positioning myself near the small, ground-level egress window that peered out onto my driveway. The frozen February earth was illuminated by a single flickering street lamp at the end of the cul-de-sac. I checked my watch. 12, 43 a.m. Then mote, 0 a.m. Nothing. The silence above me was deafening. I started to wonder if Patrick had made a mistake. Maybe I was just a paranoid old man shivering in a basement for no reason. But you never, ever ignore the smell of smoke. At mote, 4 a.m., I heard the faint crunch of tires on frost-covered gravel. 2 black, late-model SUVs rolled down my quiet, tree-lined street with their headlights completely killed. They glided to a stop right at the edge of my property line, moving with the smooth, silent menace of sharks circling in dark water. 4 men stepped out of the vehicles. They were dressed in dark, tactical utility clothing, their faces completely obscured by heavy black winter masks. They didn't move like ordinary, desperate burglars. They moved with terrifying, military precision, fanning out across my lawn and communicating with sharp, silent hand signals. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't a random neighborhood break-in. This was a highly coordinated, targeted operation. I pressed my face against the cold glass of the window pane, my breath fogging the corner of the glass. I expected the men to pull out crowbars, to pry open a ground-floor window, or pick the lock on my back patio door. Instead, the heavy mahogany front door of my house swung open from the inside. The porch light flicked on, casting a harsh, unforgiving yellow glow over the scene. Standing in the doorway was Daniel. He was fully dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks, holding a steaming mug of coffee, looking completely unbothered by the freezing night air. He casually raised a hand, gesturing for the masked men to come inside. He was holding the door for them like he was welcoming friends to a dinner party. My own son-in-law was orchestrating a home invasion. I covered my mouth with both hands to physically trap the gasp rising in my throat. I heard their heavy, heavy boots cross the threshold, the sound vibrating through the ceiling directly above my head. They were in my living room. Then, their footsteps shifted, moving down the hall toward my private study. The study was where I kept my fireproof floor safe. That safe didn't just hold old family photos. It held the original, unencumbered deed to my house. It held my living trust, and it held nearly chin chum, Kongen-bearer bonds and physical gold I had painstakingly accumulated over a lifetime of double shifts and frugal living money meant to guarantee my independence until the day I died. But to open that massive steel safe, you needed 2 things: a complex 6-digit biometric code and a physical, laser-cut override key that I kept on a titanium chain around my neck, hidden beneath my shirt. I instinctively reached to my chest. The chain was still there. The key was still there. They can't get in, I told myself, my heart thrashing like a trapped bird. Daniel doesn't have the key. He's just a greedy punk. He can't get in. As I listened to the muffled, deep voices vibrating through the floorboards above me, a new sound cut through the ticking of my clocks. It was a sound that didn't just break my heart, it completely and utterly annihilated my soul. It was a woman's voice, soft, familiar, annoyed. "No, the heavy drill won't work on that grade of steel," the voice said, echoing with crystal clarity through the aluminum air vent directly above my workbench. "Put the drill away before you wake up the old man. Just use the duplicate master key I had cut." I lifted the original off his neck when he was passed out from his tea on Sunday afternoon. It was Jessica, my little girl, my own flesh and blood. The woman whose skin knees I had bandaged, whose college tuition I had paid by working overtime in burning buildings, whose wedding I had walked her down the aisle for. She wasn't just standing by while her husband robbed me blind, she was actively guiding the crew. Above me, I heard the heavy, unmistakable clack-clack-clunk of my life savings being unlocked. They were taking everything. And as the heavy steel door of the safe swung open, I sat in the darkness of my basement, tears of profound, shattering grief hot on my cheeks. I had two choices in that exact moment. I could stay down here, let them steal my legacy, and eventually die as the frail, confused, gaslit old man they had so carefully designed me to be. Or I could remember who the hell I was. I spent 38 years learning exactly how a fire destroys a structure. Now, I was going to teach my daughter and her husband exactly how it felt to burn. The muffled thud of my heavy steel safe closing echoed through the floorboards, vibrating down into the basement where I crouched like a cornered animal. Above me, the heavy boots of the masked men moved back toward the front of the house. My joints screamed in agony from the damp cold of the concrete floor, but I didn't dare shift my weight. If one of those floorboards creaked, if they suspected for a fraction of a second that the senile old man was awake and listening, I knew with absolute certainty I wouldn't live to see the sunrise. "Did we get it all?" A gruff, unfamiliar voice muttered through the air vent. "Every last bond and the deed," Daniel replied, his tone chillingly casual, like they were discussing a grocery run. "You have the routing numbers for the offshore transfer?" "Yeah. What about the old guy? You sure he's not going to wander out here looking for a midnight snack?" There was a brief pause. Then, I heard my daughter's voice. "Please," Jessica scoffed, the sound of her dark amusement hitting me like a physical blow to the chest. Daniel mixed enough crushed lorazepam into his chamomile tea to drop a horse. "He's out for at least another 8 hours. He won't remember his own name tomorrow morning, let alone hear anything tonight." The front door clicked shut. The SUV engines purred to life, their headlights still extinguished, and the tires crunched away into the frozen February night. I thought the nightmare of that night was over the moment those vehicles drove away. I didn't know it yet, but the true psychological torture was only just beginning. I sat in the pitch-black workshop for 4 more hours, surrounded by the relentless, mocking ticking of my 23 antique clocks. Every second that passed was a piece of my old reality dying. I used to think the hardest thing a man could endure was burying his wife. Helen's death had broken my heart, but it was a clean break, a natural tragedy. What Jessica and Daniel were doing to me wasn't a tragedy. It was a slow, calculated execution. Around 9:00 a.m., the floorboards above me groaned. The house was waking up. It was time for the hardest performance of my life. I had to go upstairs, sit across the table from the two monsters who were actively destroying me, and smile. I had to be exactly what they thought I was, frail, trusting, and fading away. I unlocked the basement door with agonizing slowness, letting my arthritis act up naturally as I climbed the stairs. I shuffled into the kitchen wearing my old plaid bathrobe. The smell of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee filled the air. It smelled like a normal, happy family morning. "Morning, Dad," Jessica chirped. She was standing at the stove, flipping pancakes. She wore a soft pink sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked so wholesome, so innocent. She turned around and smiled at me, her green eyes bright. "Did you sleep well?" It took every ounce of willpower I had accumulated over nearly 7 decades not to lunge across the kitchen island and wrap my hands around her throat. Like a log, sweetie, I croaked, making my voice sound a little weaker, a little more raspy than usual. I purposely let my left hand tremble slightly as I pulled out my bar stool. Daniel strolled into the kitchen, freshly showered, smelling of expensive cologne. He slapped me on the shoulder, a little too hard. You look rested, Chester. That new tea is really doing wonders for your sleep cycle, isn't it? It sure is, Daniel. Thank you, I said, forcing my lips to curve upward. I looked at the two of them, pouring coffee, laughing about a joke on the morning news. A sickening realization washed over me. I had been missing the warning signs for months. I thought back to October, just before Halloween. I had employed a wonderful housekeeper named Maria for almost 10 years. She knew where everything was, and more importantly, she looked out for me. Then, one Tuesday, I came home from a walk to find Maria crying on the front porch, her belongings in a trash bag. Jessica had fired her, claiming she had caught Maria stealing silverware. I had defended Maria, but Jessica had produced proof, a silver spoon planted in Maria's coat pocket. It hadn't been about silverware at all. I saw it so clearly now. It was about isolation. Maria was a witness. She was someone who cared about me. Daniel and Jessica had systematically cut off every lifeline I had, pruning away my friends, my housekeeper, and my independence, until they were the only ones left. Jessica set a plate of eggs and bacon in front of me, leaning down to press a warm kiss to my forehead. Eat up, Dad. We've got a busy day. Daniel is meeting with some new investors, and I'm covering a double shift at the salon. I stared at the coffee mug in front of me. I needed time alone in the house to assess the damage to my safe, but they rarely left me completely unattended anymore. I needed to create a distraction. I reached for the hot coffee, letting my hands spasm violently. I knocked the heavy ceramic mug sideways, sending scalding dark liquid cascading across the granite countertop and splashing onto the kitchen floor, narrowly missing Daniel's polished leather shoes. "Oh, Jesus!" Daniel snapped, leaping backward, a flash of genuine annoyance breaking through his polite facade. "Oh gosh, I'm so sorry," I stammered, shrinking into myself, playing the embarrassed, clumsy old man to perfection. My hands, they just wouldn't grip it. Jessica sighed, a heavy, dramatic sound of manufactured pity. She grabbed a roll of paper towels. "It's fine, Dad. Accidents happen. Daniel, we need to get going anyway, or you'll hit the Schuylkill Expressway traffic." I didn't know it yet, but that spilled cup of coffee was about to buy me the 45 minutes I desperately needed to launch my counteroffensive. "Why don't you just go back to bed, Chester?" Daniel said, tossing a soiled paper towel into the trash with barely concealed disgust. "Take a nap. We'll order you some delivery for lunch." They treated me like a toddler. I nodded meekly, shuffling toward my bedroom, waiting until I heard the heavy thud of the front door closing and the click of the smart lock engaging. I walked to the front window, peering through the blinds until Daniel's Audi and Jessica's Lexus disappeared around the corner. The moment they were gone, the frail old man vanished. My posture straightened. The tremor in my hands disappeared. I was an investigator again, standing in the middle of a massive, burning crime scene. I moved swiftly to my private study. The heavy oak door was shut, looking perfectly undisturbed. I locked the door behind me and knelt in front of the oil painting of the Philadelphia skyline that hid my wall safe. I swung the painting aside. The digital keypad looked normal. I punched in my 6-digit code and pressed the titanium key into the mechanical override slot. The heavy locking bolts disengaged with a dull clunk. I pulled the door open, my stomach dropping into a bottomless abyss. It was gutted. The stacks of bearer bonds I had purchased in the late 90s, gone. The lockbox containing 70 ounces of physical gold bars, vanished. The original, notarized deed to my home, a house that was completely paid off and worth nearly chinchum, home on the current market, missing. They had taken it all. Over $1 million in liquid, untraceable assets, wiped out in 10 minutes while I cowered in the basement. But as I stared into the empty steel cavern, I noticed something odd. They had left a single manila folder sitting on the bottom shelf. I pulled it out, my pulse hammering against my ribs. It was my comprehensive life insurance policy, a policy worth $500,000, with Jessica listed as the sole beneficiary. Why leave this? If they were cleaning me out to run away, why leave the one document that guaranteed a massive payout upon my death? The answer chilled me to the marrow. They weren't planning on running away. They were planning on staying. The robbery last night was just phase 1. They had stolen my liquid assets to fund Daniel's mysterious debts, but they still wanted the house, and they still wanted that insurance money. I wasn't just a mark to them. I was a long-term investment. And investments mature eventually. I pulled a prepaid burner phone from a false bottom in my desk drawer. When I retired, I kept a few tricks from my undercover days. I dialed Patrick's direct line. He picked up on the first ring. "Dad, you're alive." "I'm alive," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Patrick, they cleaned out the safe, the bonds, the gold, the deed. And Jessica," Jessica was guiding them. "She stole my key." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Patrick swallowing hard. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I wanted to be wrong about her. I really did." "Who were those men last night?" I demanded, the anger finally beginning to overtake the grief. "They're identity brokers, Dad," Patrick explained, his federal agent persona taking over. "Daniel isn't a wealth management consultant. He's a professional parasite. He targets elderly, wealthy individuals, isolates them, and uses their assets to cover his massive gambling debts. He owes millions to a syndicate operating out of Atlantic City. But this is escalating. We've been watching him for 6 months, building a federal wire fraud case, but we didn't know Jessica was actively colluding." "They left my life insurance policy," I said, staring at the folder on my desk. "Patrick, they aren't done. What is phase 2? "You need to find out, Dad. I can't get a warrant for the house yet without blowing the whole federal sting operation. If they know the FBI is watching, Daniel will spook and flee the country with your money. You have to gather the intel yourself. But you have to be careful if he thinks you're on to him." "I know," I interrupted. "I'll find out what they're planning." I hung up the phone and slipped out of my study. I had 20 minutes before Maria's replacement, a sour-faced woman Daniel had hired, specifically because she didn't speak a word of English, was scheduled to arrive. I crept down the hall to the guest bedroom that Daniel had converted into his home office. The door was locked with a heavy-duty deadbolt. Daniel had always claimed it held sensitive client documents. It took me less than 40 seconds to pick the lock, with a tension wrench and a rake pick. I kept on my keychain. The door swung open silently. The room was immaculate. A massive mahogany desk, a dual-monitor computer setup, and a locked filing cabinet. I went straight for the wastebasket. People are careful with what they keep, but they are incredibly arrogant with what they throw away. Buried beneath a crumpled sandwich wrapper, I found a draft document printed on thick, legal-grade paper. I smoothed it out on the desk, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. At the top, in bold, stark letters, it read, "Petition for determination of incapacity and appointment of guardian." My name was on it, Chester Burney. It was a legal petition to the state of Pennsylvania, claiming I was suffering from severe, advanced dementia. It claimed I was a danger to myself, unable to manage my own finances, and prone to violent outbursts. It requested that Daniel and Jessica be granted total, irrevocable power of attorney over my life, my medical decisions, and my remaining property. My breath caught in my throat. This was how they were going to get away with the missing money. Once I was declared legally incompetent, no one would believe me if I claimed I had been robbed. I would just be a confused old man telling fairy tales about masked men in the night. But what I found, stapled to the back of the petition, made the blood in my veins run completely cold. It was a glossy brochure for a place called Pine Haven Assisted Living. I knew Pine Haven. During my time with the fire department, I had inspected it. It wasn't a luxury retirement home. It was a notoriously underfunded, state-run psychiatric lockdown facility, a place where the elderly were heavily medicated, strapped to beds, and left to rot away in silence. Next to the brochure was a sticky note in Daniel's handwriting. Dr. Morrison signing the incompetency eval on Friday. Commitment transfer set for the Heimwetamth. Today was the Moorlempth. I had exactly 13 days before my own daughter threw me into a padded cell to die, leaving them free to sell the house and inherit the rest of my life. I carefully folded the documents, slipped them into my bathrobe pocket, and locked Daniel's office behind me, leaving no trace I had ever been there. They thought I was just an old, broken clock, ready to be thrown in the trash. They were about to find out exactly what happens when you wind a spring too tight. 13 days. That was the exact expiration date my own daughter had stamped onto my freedom. I stood in the hallway, clutching that folded petition in my bathrobe pocket, feeling its weight like a loaded gun pressed against my ribs. It's one thing to realize your child is a thief. Greed is a common, ugly human flaw. But it is an entirely different level of pure, unadulterated evil to realize your child is planning to erase your humanity. Pine Haven wasn't a medical facility, it was an oubliette. It was where families dumped the inconvenient elderly to stare at cinder-block walls until their hearts mercifully gave out. But I didn't have time to grieve the daughter I thought I knew. I had to survive the monsters living in my house. Right on cue, the sharp chime of the doorbell echoed through the foyer. Maria's replacement had arrived. I shuffled to the door, my posture hunched, hands intentionally trembling. I opened it to find a severe-looking woman in her late 40s with tightly pulled-back dark hair and pale, unblinking eyes. She introduced herself as Ina. She carried a small duffel bag and handed me a note from Daniel, explaining she was a live-in care aide, hired to ensure my safety while he and Jessica worked. Safety. That was a rich word. I stepped aside to let her in, and within 10 minutes, I realized exactly what she was. Ina didn't ask where the cleaning supplies were. She didn't check the pantry to see what groceries we needed. Instead, she took a slow, methodical walk through the ground floor, noting the sightlines of Daniel's security cameras, checking the locks on the doors, and finally, pulling a chair into the corner of the living room where she had a clear view of the hallway leading to my bedroom. She wasn't a housekeeper. She was a warden. My own home had officially become a maximum security prison, and I was its sole inmate. I didn't know it yet, but Ina's strict surveillance was going to force me to execute one of the most dangerous tactical maneuvers of my life. Over the next 48 hours, the psychological warfare escalated. Daniel and Jessica returned home that evening, acting like the perfect, loving family. Over a dinner of roast chicken, Daniel casually mentioned a conversation we supposedly had that morning about selling my vintage clock collection. "I never agreed to that," I said, keeping my voice mild, playing the confused victim. "Oh, Dad," Jessica sighed, reaching across the table to cover my hand. Her touch felt like a physical burn. "You told us right before Daniel left for work. Don't you remember? You said the clocks were getting too hard for your hands to manage." "I did," I whispered, looking down at my plate, letting my shoulders sag. "It's okay, Chester," Daniel added smoothly, exchanging a look of profound, manufactured pity with Jessica. "Memory slips at your age. That's why we're here, to manage these heavy burdens for you." They were laying the groundwork. If I claimed I was robbed, if I claimed I wasn't losing my mind, they had months of these planted conversations to point to. They were building a fortress of lies, brick by brick. But a fortress is only strong if the foundation is solid. And my mind was razor sharp. The biggest hurdle was the nighttime tea. That evening, Daniel brought me the steaming mug of chamomile laced with his heavy sedatives. Ina watched me from the doorway, her arms crossed. I knew if I didn't drink it, they would know the jig was up. But if I did drink it, I'd lose another night, moving one day closer to the Pine Haven trap. I took the mug, smiled weakly, and walked into my attached master bathroom. I didn't dump it in the sink. Daniel had started checking the drain for residue. Instead, I opened the tank of the toilet and poured the hot liquid directly into the cold reservoir water, then flushed. I walked out, wiping my mouth, handing the empty mug to Daniel. "Tastes a little bitter tonight," I mumbled. "Just a new blend, Chester. Sleep well," he smiled. I lay in the dark for 3 hours, faking the deep, rhythmic breathing of a drugged man whenever Ina periodically cracked my door to check on me. By the second day, I realized playing defense wasn't going to save me. I needed heavy legal artillery. Years ago, during an arson investigation that involved a nursing home fire, I had crossed paths with a family law attorney named Margaret Fisher. Margaret was a shark in a tailored pantsuit. She specialized in elder rights, guardianship abuse, and tearing predatory relatives to financial shreds. If anyone could detonate Daniel and Jessica's legal petition before it reached a judge, it was her. But I couldn't just call her from my cell phone. Daniel had installed a mirroring app on it, and I couldn't just walk out the front door. Ina would immediately call Daniel. I had to orchestrate a distraction so massive that it would blind my captors just long enough for me to slip the noose. The next morning, after Daniel and Jessica left for work, I set my plan in motion. I went down to my basement workshop. Ina followed me to the top of the stairs but didn't come down. The basement was dusty, smelled of oil, and the constant ticking of the clocks made her visibly irritated. She stood at the top landing, leaning against the doorframe. "Just cleaning some gears, Ina," I called up, my voice shaking perfectly. "Keeps the hands nimble." "Don't fall," she grunted, scrolling on her phone. What she couldn't see from her angle was the main water supply line running along the ceiling above my workbench. I grabbed a heavy steel wrench. I didn't want to break the pipe completely that would flood my precious clocks. But 38 years in the fire department teaches you exactly how much pressure a municipal water valve can take before the threading gives way. I gripped the pressure release valve and wrenched it hard to the left. With a violent hiss, a high-pressure spray of freezing municipal water blasted across the basement, soaking the concrete floor and spraying directly toward the wooden stairs. "Help!" I screamed, dropping the wrench and letting out a perfectly pitched wail of panic. "Oh God, the pipe! I bumped it! Help!" Ina practically flew down the stairs, her phone flying from her hand as the freezing water pelted her in the face. She scrambled toward the valve, slipping on the wet concrete, cursing violently in Russian. "Turn the main shut-off in the utility closet," I yelled over the deafening hiss of the water, pointing to the dark, cramped room at the far end of the basement. The moment she dashed into the utility closet to wrestle with the rusted main valve, I didn't hesitate. I spun around, sprinted silently up the wooden stairs with a speed I hadn't used in a decade, and slipped out the kitchen side door into the freezing February air. I had exactly 1 hour before she managed to stop the water, call a plumber, and realize the confused old man hadn't just wandered out into the yard in a panic. I practically ran the 3 blocks to the commercial avenue, jumping into the back of a passing taxi. I handed the driver a crisp $50 bill I had hidden in my shoe. Center City, the Fisher Building. Step on it. Margaret Fisher's office was exactly as I remembered it, cold, imposing, and reeking of expensive leather and ruthless efficiency. When I walked in without an appointment, her receptionist tried to turn me away, but Margaret was walking past the front desk. She took one look at my soaking wet shoes and the desperate, burning fire in my eyes. "Chester Burney," she said, her eyebrows raised. "You look like you're either running from a fire or starting one." "I'm starting one," I said, my voice finally dropping its frail disguise. "And I need your help to burn my son-in-law to the ground." Sitting in her mahogany-lined office, I laid out everything. The stolen money, the fake housekeepers, the drugged tea, and finally, I placed the crumpled Pine Haven petition on her desk. Margaret didn't interrupt. She read the document, her jaw tightening until the muscles jumped. "This is a classic predatory guardianship maneuver," she said softly, but her eyes were lethal. "They freeze your assets, declare you incompetent, lock you away, and by the time you manage to get a message to the outside world, your estate has been liquidated. Legally, it's a nightmare to undo once the judge signs off." Daniel's note said Dr. Morrison is signing the evaluation on Friday. I said, my heart hammering. "That's in 10 days. Once they have that, they can move." "We move faster," Margaret snapped, pulling out a legal pad. "First, I am drafting a revocation of all medical and financial powers of attorney. Second, I am placing your home and remaining assets into an irrevocable trust with your son Patrick as the sole trustee. They won't be able to sell a single dining room chair without a federal agent's signature." "What about the stolen money, the bonds, and the gold?" "That's harder. It's a he said, she said right now." Margaret frowned, tapping her silver pen against the desk. "You say they stole it. They'll say you lost it, or gave it away in a state of dementia. To destroy this incompetency petition and prove the theft, we need undeniable, legally admissible proof of their malicious intent. We need them admitting to the scheme. Pennsylvania is a 2-party consent state for audio recordings, but Margaret, ever the tactical genius, smiled a wolfish grin. "There is an exception, Chester. If you record a conversation in your own home, in a common living area where there is no reasonable expectation of privacy, and you are part of the household, it becomes a beautiful gray area that I can absolutely use to secure an emergency injunction." I needed a wire, but Daniel checked me constantly. He would notice a device. "I don't need a wire," I said, a slow, dark smile spreading across my face as my eyes fell on the antique grandfather clock ticking in the corner of Margaret's office. "I have 23 Trojan horses sitting right in my living room." I made it back to the house just as a white plumbing van pulled into the driveway. I ruffled my hair, smeared a little dirt on my cheek, and wandered out from behind the backyard shed just as Ina burst through the back door, looking panicked. "Where did you go?" she shrieked, grabbing my arm so hard her nails dug into my skin. I got scared by the water," I mumbled, looking down at my shoes. "I went to hide in the shed. I'm sorry." She exhaled a ragged breath, dragging me inside. She didn't suspect a thing. I was just a frightened, broken old man who couldn't handle a broken pipe. That night, after pouring the drugged tea down the toilet again, I went to work. I had purchased a micro-digital voice recorder at an electronics store next to Margaret's office. It was no bigger than a pack of gum, voice-activated, with a 72-hour battery life. I took it down to my workshop. On my workbench sat a breathtaking Mutngin Chinchum Hai Muis, Seth Thomas mantel clock with a hollow mahogany base. I had been restoring it for weeks. It usually sat on the fireplace mantel in the living room, the exact room where Daniel and Jessica drank wine every night after they thought I was unconscious. Using my magnifying loupe and a pair of precision tweezers, I carefully unscrewed the brass baseplate. I secured the tiny black recorder inside the hollow wooden cavity, right beneath the acoustic chime bars. The wood would amplify any voices in the room, acting like a giant, antique microphone. I set the device to voice activation, screwed the plate back on, and carried the heavy clock upstairs. I placed it dead center on the living room mantel, right next to a framed wedding photo of Daniel and Jessica. Then, I went to bed, and I waited. The trap was set. For 3 days, I played the part. I spilled my food. I asked the same questions twice. I let Jessica pat my hand, and Daniel speak to me like a slow child. On Thursday morning, after they left for work, I retrieved the clock. I took it down to the basement, my hands sweating as I unscrewed the baseplate and extracted the tiny recorder. I plugged my headphones into the device, hit play, and closed my eyes. The first few hours were nothing, the sound of the TV, the clinking of wine glasses. But then, I heard Daniel's voice, clear as day. "The Atlantic City guys are getting impatient," Daniel hissed. "They want the other $500,000 by the 1st of the month, or they're going to break my legs, Jess. We can't wait until the 28th to move the old man." My blood ran cold. But what happened next didn't just chill my blood, it stopped my heart completely. "I know," Jessica's voice replied. It wasn't the soft, sweet voice she used with me. It was hard, cold, calculating. "I already took care of it." "What do you mean?" Daniel asked, sounding surprised. "Patrick called me yesterday. He asked too many questions about Dad's finances. He's getting suspicious," Jessica said smoothly. "If we wait, Patrick might file for an emergency conservatorship himself, and then the FBI is auditing our accounts. We can't wait for the 28th. So what did you do?" "I called Dr. Morrison. I paid him an extra 10 grand from the gold we fenced. He signed the incompetency papers yesterday." The sound of wine pouring into a glass echoed through my headphones. "I'm taking Dad for a scenic drive this Sunday morning, but we aren't coming back. I'm dropping him at Pine Haven. By the time Patrick figures it out on Monday, Dad will be strapped to a bed in a locked psychiatric ward, pumped full of haloperidol, and legally dead to the world." My breath hitched in my chest. Sunday. 13 days had just violently compressed into 3. Sunday. The word echoed in my skull, louder than the ticking of the 23 clocks surrounding me. 3 days. I had exactly 3 days before my own flesh and blood drove me to a state-run psychiatric lockdown, stripped me of my civil rights, and abandoned me to rot in a chemically induced fog. I took off the headphones, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped the micro-recorder onto the concrete floor. The sheer, absolute coldness in Jessica's voice wasn't something I could process. It defied the laws of nature. You raise a child, you protect them from the monsters under the bed, and you never expect them to become the monster standing over yours. I didn't cry. I think the part of my soul that could weep for my daughter had permanently burned away, leaving only cold, hard ash. And from that ash, something else was taking shape. A methodical, relentless fury. I didn't just want to survive this anymore. I wanted to see the exact moment the trap they built for me snapped back and crushed them. But I had an immediate, massive problem. I couldn't just hand the recording to Margaret Fisher and wait for the legal system to slowly churn. If Daniel and Jessica forced me into that car on Sunday morning, Dr. Morrison's forged incompetency evaluation would activate. Once I was inside Pine Haven, fighting the system from a locked ward would take months. I needed to cut off the head of the snake before Sunday. And to do that, I needed my own medical evaluation proving my sanity. How does a man under 24-hour surveillance by a hostile Russian warden manage to see a psychiatrist? You don't go to the doctor. You bring the doctor into the prison. I pulled out my burner phone and texted Margaret the horrifying timeline update. Her reply was instantaneous. "Understood. We accelerate. I'm sending Dr. Robert Hill to you tomorrow at high p.m. Play along. I didn't know how Margaret planned to smuggle a top-tier geriatric psychiatrist past Inna, but I had learned to trust the shark. I spent the rest of Thursday and the entirety of Friday morning laying the groundwork for my own psychological decay. If they wanted a broken man, I'd give them a masterpiece. I started staring blankly out the window for hours. When Inna asked me what I wanted for lunch, I called her Helen, my late wife's name. The flash of cruel satisfaction in Inna's pale eyes told me everything I needed to know. She immediately texted Daniel. They thought the heavy sedatives were finally breaking down my neural pathways. At exactly high p.m. on Friday, the doorbell rang. Inna marched to the front door, peering through the peephole. I shuffled out of the living room, hovering behind her, acting confused and agitated. "Who is it?" I mumbled, grabbing the collar of my robe. Inna opened the door a fraction of an inch, leaving the heavy brass chain engaged. Standing on the porch was a man in his late 60s, wearing a faded Philadelphia Fire Department jacket, a battered baseball cap, and carrying a cardboard box smelling strongly of grease and roasted garlic. "Hey there," the man boomed, his voice thick with a South Philly accent. "I'm looking for Chester Burney." Charlie Higgins, engine Bon Muy High, brought the old-timer his favorite meatball subs from Dynex. Inna scowled, blocking the gap. "Mr. Burney is resting. No visitors." "Charlie?" I gasped, pushing past Inna with a burst of manufactured desperate energy. I threw my weight against the door, rattling the chain. "Charlie! Let him in, Inna! It's Captain Charlie. We fought the Broad Street warehouse fire together." I grabbed Inna's wrist, my eyes wide and frantic. "Please, it's my captain." Inna hesitated. She had strict orders to keep me isolated, but causing a massive physical scene on the front porch in broad daylight with an old fireman wasn't part of Daniel's clean, quiet plan. She unlatched the chain with an annoyed huff, stepping back. 30 minutes, she ordered sharply, pointing a finger at Charlie. "He gets tired." 30 minutes is all we need, sweetheart," Charlie winked, stepping inside and clapping me on the back. The moment we were sitting in the kitchen, eating the sandwiches, the boisterous old fireman persona dissolved entirely. Dr. Robert Hill didn't waste a single second. While Inna stood in the adjacent living room, pretending to dust the bookshelf but keeping her eyes glued to us, Dr. Hill leaned in close. Between loud fake laughs about non-existent firehouse pranks, Dr. Hill was whispering a rapid-fire, highly complex cognitive evaluation. "Chester, remember these 3 words. Apple, table, penny. Now, count backward from 100 by 7s, he murmured, taking a bite of his sandwich. 93, 86, 79, 72, I replied seamlessly, keeping a dopey, nostalgic smile plastered on my face for Inna's benefit. "Excellent. What is the geopolitical significance of the Panama Canal?" he asked, wiping grease from his chin. I answered flawlessly. "We spent 25 minutes conducting a stealth psychiatric exam disguised as old men swapping war stories. Dr. Hill tested my short-term memory, my logic processing, my spatial awareness, and my abstract reasoning." When Inna finally walked into the kitchen and tapped her watch, Dr. Hill stood up. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a sealed envelope, and smoothly slipped it under the napkin dispenser on the table without breaking eye contact with the warden. "Good seeing you, Chess," Dr. Hill said loudly. "Keep your powder dry." As Inna escorted him out, I slid the envelope into my waistband. Inside was a sworn, signed affidavit from one of the most respected psychiatrists in the state. It certified that Chester Burney possessed a superior cognitive baseline, 0 signs of dementia, and absolute legal capacity to manage his own affairs. I had my armor. Now, I needed my sword. Later that evening, Patrick called my burner phone. I sat in the darkest corner of my basement, the hum of the furnace masking my voice. "Dad, I heard the tape Margaret sent over," Patrick said. His voice wasn't tight with panic anymore. It was dead calm. The kind of calm a federal agent gets right before they kick down a door. "I am going to bury him. The FBI raid is officially green-lit." "When?" I asked, gripping the phone. "Monday morning. We've traced the wire transfers to the Atlantic City Syndicate. Daniel's entire operation is going to be seized. But Dad, Sunday. I can't let them take you to Pine Haven. I'll pull up with a squad car on Sunday morning and arrest them on the driveway if I have to." "No," I whispered fiercely. "If you arrest them before they try to take me, Jessica's lawyer will claim it was just a misunderstanding. She'll say they were taking me for a drive, just like the tape said. They haven't technically committed the act of false imprisonment or guardianship fraud yet. Dad, it's too dangerous. If they get you inside those doors. They won't, I promised, staring at the ticking face of an Motngin Tam Chum Chinmui's pocket watch on my desk. Let them put me in the car. Let them drive me there. I want them to believe they've won. I want them to feel the absolute peak of their arrogance right before the floor falls out from under them. Patrick was silent for a long time. Finally, he exhaled. You're a stubborn old man, Chester. That's exactly what I'm counting on. Saturday arrived like a slow-moving executioner. The psychological tension inside the house was so thick you could choke on it. Daniel and Jessica were practically buzzing with nervous, predatory energy. Tomorrow was their payday. Tomorrow, the burden was lifted. The $1 million was theirs, and the house would go on the market. What happened that afternoon, however, nearly broke me. I was sitting in my armchair in the living room, staring blankly at the television. Jessica walked in carrying a small brown leather duffel bag, my old overnight bag. She sat down next to me on the sofa. I could smell her vanilla perfume. Dad, she said softly, her voice dripping with that manufactured, sugary sweetness. I packed you a bag. A bag, I repeated, looking at it with wide, confused eyes. Are we going somewhere, Jessie? Just a little trip tomorrow morning, Daddy, she said, reaching out to stroke my hair. The sheer psychopathy of her gentle touch made my skin crawl. A nice scenic drive up to the mountains. There's a special resort there, a place where doctors can give you the right vitamins so you don't feel so confused anymore. She was folding my favorite woolen sweaters. She was packing my comfortable slippers. She was preparing my burial clothes with a smile. Will you and Daniel stay with me? I asked, forcing my lower lip to quiver. A flash of something crossed her eyes. Guilt? Annoyance? It was gone in an instant. We'll visit, Dad, every single day. We love you so much. She leaned forward and kissed my cheek. Judas, in a pink cashmere sweater. I love you too, Jessie, I whispered. And as I said it, the last remaining thread of paternal affection I held for this woman snapped. Saturday night was the final, critical hurdle. They needed me utterly compliant for the Sunday morning drive. I knew the tea was coming, and I knew Daniel wouldn't take any chances tonight. At Chin, Bamui p.m., Daniel walked into the living room holding the steaming mug. But this time, he didn't set it on the side table and walk away. He pulled up a chair directly across from me. Jessica stood in the doorway, her arms crossed. Drink up, Chester, Daniel said, his smile tight and unyielding. Got a big day tomorrow. Need you fully rested. My heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I couldn't dump it in the toilet. I couldn't spill it. He would just brew another batch. I stared at the mug, then at Daniel's unblinking eyes. He was watching my throat to ensure I swallowed. It's too hot, I mumbled, bringing the mug to my lips and taking a tiny, agonizingly slow sip. The bitter, chemical taste of crushed lorazepam hit my tongue immediately. Blow on it, Jessica commanded from the doorway. Her voice was sharp, the sweet daughter routine slipping as impatience took over. I took another sip. I had to think. I had to create chaos. As I brought the mug to my mouth for a third time, I didn't swallow. I let the liquid pool in the back of my throat. Then, I intentionally inhaled it directly into my windpipe. My body reacted violently, exactly as nature intended. I lurched forward, dropping the mug onto the Persian rug as a massive, uncontrollable coughing fit seized my lungs. My face turned bright red, then purple. I choked, gasping for air, clutching my chest as the hot liquid burned my airway. Dad! Jessica yelled, rushing forward. I fell sideways onto the floor, hacking and wheezing, spitting the liquid onto the carpet. I made it look terrifying. I made it look like a massive cardiac event. Daniel grabbed my shoulders, pulling me up, panic finally breaking his cool facade. Chester, hey, look at me. I continued to gag and heave, my eyes watering, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I pointed weakly at my chest, letting my eyes roll back slightly. Did he take his heart medication today? Daniel shouted at Inna, who had sprinted into the room. He's choking, Jessica panicked. Should I call Chinchamwe Mot? No, Daniel barked, his eyes wide. No cops, no paramedics tonight. We are too close. Just get him water. They hoisted me up, slapping my back, forcing a glass of cold water to my lips. I drank it, washing away the bitter taste of the sedative, slowly letting my breathing return to normal. I slumped against the couch, groaning, wiping spit and tears from my chin. I'm okay, I wheezed, acting utterly exhausted. Just went down the wrong pipe. So tired. I just want to lay down. Get him to bed, Daniel ordered Inna, wiping sweat from his forehead. He looked at the spilled tea soaking into the rug, then back at me. I hadn't consumed enough of the drug to put me to sleep, but the physical trauma of the choking fit gave me the perfect excuse to act comatose. Inna half carried me to my bedroom. I collapsed onto the mattress, keeping my eyes closed, letting my body go completely limp. I heard her lock the door from the outside. I lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, my heart still racing from the adrenaline. I had survived the tea. My mind was clear. The digital clock on my nightstand read high, muy bon AM. In 5 hours, the sun would rise on Sunday. I was drifting into a light, strategic doze when I heard it. The subtle, metallic click of my bedroom door, unlocking. I kept my breathing perfectly rhythmic, my eyes shut, not moving a muscle. The door creaked open. Soft footsteps crossed the hardwood floor, stopping directly beside my bed. I didn't know it yet, but my daughter and her husband weren't satisfied with a botched dose of tea. Through the sliver of my partially opened eyelids, in the dim moonlight filtering through the blinds, I saw Daniel standing over me. And in his right hand, reflecting the pale light, was a medical syringe filled with a thick, clear liquid. He hadn't come to check on me. He had come to make absolutely sure the old man didn't wake up during the drive to Pine Haven. The silver needle hovered barely 2 inches above the crook of my arm. Through the sliver of my partially opened eyelids, I could see a bead of clear liquid welling at the very tip of the steel. Daniel's face was twisted into a mask of pure, desperate concentration. He was sweating, his breathing shallow and rapid in the quiet darkness of my bedroom. He pressed 2 fingers against my vein, searching for the pulse. Every muscle in my 67-year-old body went rigid. I had spent 38 years hauling heavy hoses up 3 flights of stairs and dragging unconscious victims out of burning buildings. I might have been playing a frail old man, but my grip strength was still enough to snap Daniel's wrist like a dry twig. I braced my legs beneath the heavy quilt. The moment that needle touched my skin, I was going to break his arm, consequences be damned. But I didn't have to. A sharp, violent whisper hissed from the bedroom doorway. "Daniel, what the hell are you doing?" Daniel froze, the syringe hovering just above my flesh. He looked back over his shoulder. Jessica was standing in the doorframe, her silhouette illuminated by the hallway nightlight. "I'm making sure," Daniel whispered back, his voice trembling with manic energy. He coughed up half the tea. "If he wakes up lucid in the car tomorrow and starts screaming at the Pine Haven nurses, Morrison's forged paperwork won't hold up. They'll call the cops. I got this from a guy in the syndicate. It's a concentrated muscle relaxant. It'll keep him perfectly docile." I waited for my daughter to tell her husband that he was crossing a line. I waited for some microscopic shred of human decency, some dormant instinct of a child protecting her father, to finally kick in. I didn't know it yet, but my daughter's soul was far darker than Daniel's gambling debts could ever be. "Put it away," Jessica ordered, stepping into the room. Her voice was ice cold, completely devoid of emotion. "If you push that into his vein, and his heart gives out on the highway, the coroner will do an autopsy. You know what they look for in unexplained cardiac events? Puncture wounds. If they find one, the $500,000 life insurance policy is instantly voided, and we both get indicted for murder." "He's a liability right now, Jess," Daniel hissed. "He's a paycheck," Jessica corrected him, her tone deadening my spirit more effectively than any chemical ever could. "Look at him, Daniel. He's 80% dead already. He doesn't even know what year it is. He's not going to put up a fight. Now throw that damn needle down the garbage disposal and pack the car." Daniel let out a frustrated breath, but he pulled the syringe away. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the room. Jessica stood by my bed for a long moment. I kept my breathing slow, rhythmic, and shallow. I felt her hand brush the hair off my forehead. "Sleep tight, Daddy," she whispered into the dark. "Tomorrow, you get to finally rest." She closed the door, leaving me in the pitch black. A single tear, hot and heavy with a grief I couldn't articulate, slipped out of the corner of my eye and soaked into my pillow. My little girl was gone. The woman standing in my house was a calculating, cold-blooded sociopath who viewed my pulse as an inconvenience to her bank account. The fire inside me burned away the last of the ash. There was no more sadness. There was only the mission. Sunday morning dawned overcast and bitterly cold. The sky was a bruising shade of purple-gray, fitting perfectly with the funeral march playing out inside my home. Inna dragged me out of bed roughly at 7 o'clock. They didn't bother pretending to be gentle anymore. The endgame had arrived, and the masks were fully off. Inna shoved my arms into a heavy wool sweater and practically dragged me into the living room, planting me onto the sofa like a sack of damp flour. I let my head loll to the side, my mouth hanging slightly open. I stared blankly at the Persian rug, the same rug Daniel had tried to murder me on 12 hours earlier. Daniel came downstairs, carrying my overnight bag. He didn't even look at me. He was on his phone, typing furiously, likely updating his Atlantic City loan sharks that the final payout was imminent. Jessica followed closely behind him, dressed impeccably in a dark trench coat and knee-high leather boots, looking like she was heading to a high-end brunch rather than committing her father to a psychiatric ward. "Let's go," Daniel snapped. "Traffic on the turnpike is going to be a nightmare by 9. Jessica walked over to me, grabbing me by the bicep and pulling me upright. "Come on, Dad. Time for a ride." I shuffled my feet, letting my knees buckle slightly so Daniel had to come over and take my other arm. They practically carried me out the front door and down the porch steps. The cold air hit my face, biting and sharp, but I didn't react. I let them fold me into the back seat of Daniel's Audi. I slumped against the cold leather, staring blankly out the tinted window as Daniel slammed the door shut, locking the child safety mechanisms. The drive to Pine Haven took an hour and 15 minutes. It was the most agonizing 75 minutes of my entire existence. They assumed I was in a chemical stupor, completely deaf to the world. Because of that fatal assumption, they spoke freely in the front seat. And what I heard confirmed exactly why Margaret Fisher was preparing to drop a nuclear bomb on their lives. Jessica synced her phone to the car's Bluetooth and played a light jazz playlist. As we merged onto the highway, Daniel reached over and squeezed her thigh. "By noon today, the conservatorship is legally binding," Daniel said, his voice practically vibrating with relief. "I've got the real estate agent coming to the house on Tuesday. She says, in this market, we can list it for $950 and have a cash buyer in a week." "Good," Jessica murmured, sipping her latte. "I already started looking at condos in Miami, Brickell Avenue. We need to get out of Philly before the winter really sets in." "What about his junk in the basement?" Daniel asked, gesturing vaguely toward the back seat. "Those creepy old clocks. Some of them look like they might be worth a few bucks." "Don't even bother," Jessica scoffed, waving a manicured hand. "It'll take too long to appraise them. Just rent a commercial dumpster and have the movers toss them all. I want the house completely staged and sterile by Wednesday. My life's work. 23 meticulously restored pieces of mechanical history. The clocks she used to help me fix when she was a little girl. Tossed into a dumpster to make room for her Miami condo. My fingernails dug so deeply into the palms of my hands, I felt the skin break, but I kept my face utterly slack, my eyes fixed on the gray blur of the highway. Then came the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. "You know," Daniel chuckled darkly, "I really thought you were going to lose your nerve, Jess, when I told you how much trouble I was in with the syndicate. I thought you were going to pack your bags and divorce me." "I thought about it," Jessica replied smoothly. "But I like my lifestyle, Daniel. I like my cars, and I like my clothes. I wasn't going to let your stupid gambling habit drag me back to the middle class. When I remembered Dad's life insurance policy and the equity in the house, it just made sense. It was the cleanest way out." I closed my eyes. It hadn't been Daniel manipulating my innocent daughter. It was a joint enterprise. She had offered me up as the sacrificial lamb to protect her own luxury. "We're here," Daniel announced abruptly. I opened my eyes. We were pulling through a set of heavy, wrought-iron gates. The sign read, Pine Haven Behavioral Health. It looked less like a hospital and more like a minimum security penitentiary. It was a sprawling, brutalist concrete structure surrounded by tall chain-link fencing. There were no gardens. There were no elderly people sitting on patios. It was a cold, gray fortress designed to swallow people whole and never spit them back out. Daniel parked near the main entrance. An orderly waiting by the sliding glass doors immediately approached the car, pushing a heavy-duty, institutional wheelchair with thick leather restraining straps attached to the armrests. "Mr. and Mrs. Harris?" the orderly asked, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. He was a massive man, with a thick neck and a name tag that read Garris. "That's us," Daniel said, popping the trunk to grab my overnight bag. "We have an intake appointment with administration." Dr. Morrison sent the paperwork over yesterday. Garrus opened my door and unbuckled my seatbelt. He grabbed me by the front of my sweater and roughly hauled me out of the car, dumping me unceremoniously into the wheelchair. I let my head drop forward, offering zero resistance. Garrus immediately buckled a thick canvas strap across my waist, locking me into the chair. He's been heavily sedated, Jessica lied smoothly, adopting her sorrowful daughter persona for the orderly. He gets very violent and confused when he travels. Don't worry, ma'am, Garrus grunted, unlocking the wheels. We deal with the biters and the fighters all the time. He'll be completely manageable by the time the intake cocktail hits his system. The intake cocktail. My heart spiked. They weren't just going to lock me in a room. They were going to intravenously drug me the moment I crossed the threshold. Garrus wheeled me through the sliding glass doors. The smell of the place hit me like a physical wall. It smelled of industrial bleach, overcooked institutional food, and the unmistakable, stale odor of human despair. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a maddening, relentless hum. We bypassed the main waiting area entirely, moving down a long, linoleum-tiled corridor toward a set of heavy double doors labeled Secure Ward, Authorized Personnel Only. Before we reached the doors, Garrus wheeled me into a sterile, windowless office. Sitting behind a cheap metal desk was an administrator with slicked-back hair and a severe lack of empathy in his eyes. "Ah, the Bernie intake," the administrator said, tapping a thick manila folder. "I have Dr. Morrison's incompetency evaluation right here. Severe cognitive decline, aggressive tendencies, total lack of situational awareness. Sounds like he requires our highest tier of supervised care. Whatever he needs to be comfortable," Jessica said softly, dabbing at a dry eye with a tissue. "Just need your signatures on the conservatorship transfer and the medical proxy release, Mrs. Harris." The administrator slid a clipboard across the desk. "Once this is signed, Pinehaven assumes full custodial control of the patient's daily operations, and you have full legal control of his external assets." Jessica took the pen. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look at me. She leaned over the desk and began signing away my human rights, one dotted line at a time. I sat strapped in the wheelchair, watching the black ink seal my fate. The legal trap was officially closed. They had committed the crime on paper, in front of witnesses. Garrus stepped up beside my wheelchair, pulling a pre-filled syringe from his scrub pocket. It was a massive dose of Thorazine, designed to completely wipe a patient's short-term memory and motor function. He flicked the needle with a thick finger, preparing to plunge it directly into my neck. "All right, Pops," Garrus muttered, gripping my shoulder with a heavy hand. "Time to go to sleep." Jessica capped the pen and turned to me, offering one last, sickeningly sweet smile. "Goodbye, Dad. I'll see you soon." I didn't know it yet, but the moment I had been planning for, the moment I had endured a year of psychological torture to reach, had finally arrived in perfectly orchestrated time. The needle descended toward my skin. I didn't wait for it to hit. I stopped acting. My posture snapped perfectly straight. The blank, vacant expression vanished from my face, replaced by the cold, calculated glare of a seasoned fire inspector who had just found the arsonist holding the matches. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Garrus," I said. My voice didn't shake. It didn't waver. It rang through the sterile, windowless room like a gunshot. Garrus froze, the needle inches from my carotid artery. Daniel physically recoiled, stumbling backward into the filing cabinet. Jessica dropped the clipboard, her mouth falling open in a look of absolute, unadulterated shock. Before any of them could process the fact that the senile old man had just spoken with terrifying clarity, the heavy wooden door of the administrator's office didn't just open. It violently exploded inward. The heavy wooden door didn't just open. It violently exploded inward, sending shards of cheap particle board flying across the sterile linoleum floor. "Federal agents, drop the needle and step away from the patient. Hands in the air, right now." The voice belonged to Patrick. He stormed into the cramped administrative office, a matte black sidearm drawn and leveled squarely at the orderly's chest. He was flanked by 3 more agents in dark Kevlar vests with bold yellow FBI lettering across the back, and 2 uniformed local police officers. Garrus yelped, his massive frame instantly shrinking as he dropped the syringe. It hit the floor and shattered, the clear, sedating liquid pooling into the grout lines. The administrator threw his hands up so fast he knocked his own coffee cup off the desk. Daniel's survival instincts finally kicked in, but they were useless. He lunged toward the secondary exit, leading to the secure ward. but a federal agent twice his size slammed him brutally against the cinder block wall. The metallic, heavy clack of handcuffs ratcheting around Daniel's wrists echoed like a church bell in the tiny room. Jessica screamed. It was a high, piercing sound of pure, unadulterated terror. She backed into the corner, knocking over a stack of medical charts, her hands hovering over her mouth as she stared at the guns, the vests, and the federal badges. The chaos in the room was deafening. Agents were shouting clearance codes, Daniel was sputtering frantic, panicked denials against the wall, and the administrator was hyperventilating. Through it all, I remained perfectly, eerily still. I looked down at the heavy canvas strap buckled across my waist. With slow, deliberate movements, I unlatched the heavy metal buckle. The thick leather restraints fell away from my arms. I planted my feet on the cold floor and stood up from the institutional wheelchair. I smoothed down the front of my wool sweater, rolled my shoulders back, and stood at my full height. I looked directly into my daughter's eyes. I watched the exact millisecond her brain finally processed what was happening. Her gaze darted from the shattered syringe on the floor to Patrick's leveled weapon, and finally, back to me. The frail, confused old man she had patronized for a year was gone. In his place stood a fire inspector who had just successfully engineered a controlled demolition. "Hello, Patrick," I said calmly, my voice steady and resonant in the small room. "Are you unharmed, Dad?" Patrick asked, not taking his eyes off Garrus, who was currently being shoved to his knees and cuffed by a local officer. "I'm perfectly fine," I replied, "though I think my son-in-law's blood pressure might be a little high." "This is insane," Daniel screamed, struggling against the agent pinning him to the wall. His perfectly styled hair was mashed against the cinder block, his expensive tailored suit bunching awkwardly around his shoulders. "Patrick, what the hell are you doing? He's got dementia." "We're checking him into a medical facility. You can't arrest me for trying to get your father psychiatric help." "He's not arresting you for medical fraud, Daniel," a crisp, razor-sharp voice announced from the doorway. Margaret Fisher stepped into the room. She was wearing a tailored navy blue suit, carrying a thick leather briefcase, and looking at Daniel the way a hawk looks at a field mouse. "He's arresting you for wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny," Margaret said smoothly, dropping her briefcase onto the administrator's desk with a heavy thud. She turned her lethal gaze to the administrator, who was shaking so violently his teeth were practically chattering. Margaret reached into her briefcase and pulled out the crisp, white envelope Dr. Hill had given me. She slapped it down right on top of the forged Pine Haven incompetency petition. "That is a sworn psychiatric evaluation conducted 48 hours ago by Dr. Robert Hill, the foremost geriatric specialist in Pennsylvania," Margaret stated, her voice slicing through the room's tension. "It certifies Chester Burney is of superior cognitive health. Your forged evaluation from Dr. Morrison was purchased with $10,000 fenced from stolen gold. The FBI raided Morrison's clinic 20 minutes ago. He's already singing like a canary." The administrator's knees buckled. He sank into his leather office chair, burying his face in his hands. I didn't know it yet, but Patrick's investigation had uncovered a twist so massive, it turned my personal revenge into a federal takedown. "Did you really think Pine Haven was just a crappy nursing home, Daniel?" Patrick asked, holstering his weapon and stepping toward his brother-in-law. His voice was laced with absolute disgust. "We've been tracking the Atlantic City syndicate for a year. We knew they were laundering money, but we didn't know how they were hiding the victims who got too loud. Until you led us right to their dumping ground." Daniel's face drained of all color. He looked like a corpse. "The administrator here isn't just a corrupt bureaucrat," Patrick continued, gesturing to the man sobbing behind the desk. "He's on the syndicate's payroll. This facility is where the mob drops the elderly marks after they've drained their bank accounts. They drug them into a permanent vegetative state so they can't testify. You weren't just putting Dad in a home, Daniel. You were handing him over to the mob to be chemically lobotomized." The sheer gravity of what had almost happened to me settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Even the federal agents looked sickened. And then, just when I thought the absolute bottom had been reached, Jessica made her move. She pushed herself out of the corner, tears streaming down her flawless makeup-stained cheeks. She stumbled toward Patrick, her hands clasped together in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Patrick. Oh my God. Patrick, thank you," Jessica sobbed, her voice trembling with perfect, theatrical vulnerability. "You don't understand. I didn't know." Daniel forced me into this. He told me he was in debt to dangerous people, and he said if I didn't help him get Dad into this clinic, they were going to kill us both. He threatened me, Patrick. I was so scared. She reached out to grab her brother's tactical vest, but Patrick took a sharp step back, his face a mask of cold stone. "Save the performance, Jess," Patrick said, his voice flat and devoid of any brotherly affection. "It's true," Jessica wailed, pivoting toward me. She rushed to my side, grabbing my hands. Her grip was tight, desperate. "Dad, please believe me. I love you." "I would never hurt you. He drugged your tea. I tried to stop him from injecting you last night. I was trying to protect you." It was a brilliant pivot. A desperate, cornered rat, trying to gnaw off its own leg to escape the trap. She was betting everything on the assumption that she had covered her tracks, that Daniel had been the only one foolish enough to leave a paper trail. I looked down at her hands gripping mine. I felt nothing. No warmth, no pity, no paternal instinct to soothe her crying. I gently, but firmly, pried her fingers off my skin and let her hands drop to her sides. "I know you stopped him from injecting me last night, Jessica," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "But it wasn't to protect me. It was to protect the $500,000 life insurance payout in case the coroner found a puncture wound." Jessica froze. The fake tears instantly stopped. Her breath hitched in her throat, her green eyes widening in absolute horror as she realized she had stepped onto a landmine she couldn't see. I reached into my sweater pocket, pulled out my burner phone, and tapped the screen. I cranked the volume to maximum and hit play. The audio from my living room filled the cramped, silent office. "I thought about it," Jessica's recorded voice echoed, clear and damning. "But I like my lifestyle, Daniel. I like my cars, and I like my clothes. I wasn't going to let your stupid gambling habit drag me back to the middle class. When I remembered Dad's life insurance policy and the equity in the house, it just made sense. It was the cleanest way out." The silence that followed the recording was so profound you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Jessica's knees physically gave out. She collapsed onto the linoleum floor, her hands gripping her hair, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The pristine, untouchable facade was entirely shattered. She wasn't a victim. She was the architect of my execution. "You recorded us?" Daniel whispered from the wall, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. "The clocks. You put a wire in the clocks." "Patience, Daniel," I said coldly, quoting the exact lesson I had taught Jessica when she was 8 years old. "Every piece has its place. You just have to learn the patterns." Seeing his wife crumble on the floor, realizing the audio recording had just torpedoed any chance of a shared defense, Daniel snapped. The thief's honor instantly evaporated. "She set it up," Daniel screamed, thrashing against his cuffs, pointing a trembling finger at his wife on the floor. "She's the one who gave me the safe combination. She lifted the override key off his neck. I didn't want to bring him to Pine Haven. That was her idea. I'll testify. Patrick, I'll flip on the Atlantic City Syndicate. I'll give you the bosses. Just give me a deal and lock her up." "Shut up, Daniel," Jessica shrieked, scrambling backward on the floor like a crab, pointing right back at him. "It was his operation. He forged the deeds. He sold the bonds." I watched my daughter and her husband tear each other to shreds, screaming accusations, begging federal agents for immunity, offering up each other's lives to save their own skin. It was pathetic. It was ugly. And it was exactly what they deserved. "Take him out of here," Patrick ordered, looking thoroughly sickened by the display. 2 agents hauled Daniel out the door. He was still screaming about a plea deal as they dragged him down the long corridor toward the squad cars. Garrus and the administrator were escorted out right behind him. Suddenly, the room was eerily quiet. It was just me, Patrick, Margaret Fisher, and Jessica, who was still sitting on the dirty floor, shivering violently in her expensive trench coat. She looked up at Patrick, her eyes raw and bloodshot. Are you going to arrest me?" she whispered. Patrick looked at Margaret, then back at his sister. "Federal wire fraud requires proof of direct involvement with the syndicate's financial transfers. You were careful, Jess. Your name isn't on the offshore accounts. The audio proves conspiracy for the conservatorship, but that's a state-level civil matter, not an FBI jurisdiction." A fleeting, microscopic glimmer of hope flashed across Jessica's face. She actually thought, for one split second, that she was going to walk out of Pine Haven a free woman. "So I'm not going to jail," she breathed, wiping her nose. "No, Jessica. Margaret Fisher stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. She unclasped her leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of legal documents thicker than a phone book. She dropped them onto the floor, right between Jessica's knee-high leather boots. "You're not going to jail. You are going to hell." Jessica stared at the stack of papers. "That is a 30-day eviction notice from your father's property," Margaret stated, her voice ringing with lethal authority. "Beneath that is a preliminary injunction freezing every single joint bank account, credit line, and asset you share with your husband. And beneath that is a civil lawsuit for $1.2 million, citing emotional distress, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and conspiracy to commit guardianship fraud." Jessica's trembling hands hovered over the documents. $1.2 million. I don't have that. My accounts are frozen. The syndicate has Daniel's money. I have nothing. You're leaving me with absolutely nothing. I looked down at my daughter, the girl I had raised, the woman who had packed my bags for a psychiatric ward, with a smile on her face. I didn't know it yet, but the final devastating blow of my revenge had nothing to do with lawyers or federal agents. It had to do with the money. "You're right, Jessica," I said softly, crouching down so I was exactly at her eye level. "You have nothing, but what you don't realize is exactly how much danger you are currently in." Her breath hitched. "What do you mean?" "The Atlantic City Syndicate," I whispered, watching her pupils dilate with fresh, creeping horror. "Daniel told them he was paying the $500,000 debt tomorrow. But the FBI just froze those offshore accounts before the transfer cleared. Daniel is in federal custody. He can't pay them." I stood up, adjusting my coat, looking down at her one last time. "When loan sharks realize the husband is locked away and the debt is unpaid, they don't just write it off, Jesse. They come for the wife." The silence of the house was the first thing I noticed when Patrick pulled the car into my driveway late that Sunday afternoon. For months, this property had hummed with a predatory energy, the sound of Daniel's expensive shoes clicking on the hardwood, the artificial chime of the security cameras alerting his phone to my every move, the low, conspiratorial whispers behind closed doors. Now, the air was as still as a tomb. The FBI had finished their initial sweep, hauling away Daniel's computers and his mountain of forged documents. They had even taken the care aide, Inna, in for questioning, leaving the side door swinging loosely in the freezing February wind. I stood on the sidewalk, my hands buried deep in the pockets of my wool coat. Patrick stood beside me, his tactical vest replaced by a heavy jacket, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees with the practiced alertness of a man who knew the monsters weren't all behind bars. "You don't have to stay here tonight, Dad," Patrick said, his voice soft. "My guest room is ready. The kids would love to see you. We can have a security detail sit on the house until we're sure the syndicate has moved on." I looked up at the stone facade of the home I had bought with Helen 35 years ago. I thought about the attic where her wedding dress was still packed in cedar, and the basement where I had spent a decade bringing dead clocks back to life. "If I leave now, Patrick, I'm letting them win," I said. "This house was a prison for a year. I need to remind it that I'm the one with the keys." Patrick nodded slowly. He understood. He walked me to the door, checked the new locks he'd had his team install, and handed me a high-frequency radio, Channel 4. "If you see a shadow move that shouldn't, you press the button. I'm 5 minutes away." I watched his car pull away, the red taillights disappearing into the gloom of the Philadelphia evening. I stepped inside and didn't turn on a single light. I didn't need to. I knew every inch of this place. I knew where the shadows pooled and where the floorboards kept their secrets. I walked straight to the living room mantel. I picked up the Motngin Chincham Hai Mui's Seth Thomas clock, the one that had captured the confession that destroyed my daughter's life. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a heavy, hollow H in the center of my chest. I carried the clock down to the basement, my true sanctuary, and set it on my workbench. I didn't know it yet, but the most dangerous secret in this house hadn't been tucked away in my safe. It was hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right pair of eyes to find the pattern. I spent the next 4 hours purging the house. I didn't use a screwdriver. I used a hammer. I smashed the security cameras Daniel had installed in the hallways, ripping the wires out of the drywall with a visceral satisfaction. I gathered every bottle of that special tea and every vial of the sedatives I'd found hidden in the back of the pantry and flushed them all. By midnight, the house was physically cleansed, but it still felt crowded. I felt the ghost of Jessica's laugh in the kitchen. I felt the cold phantom of Daniel's hand on my shoulder. To drown out the memories, I went back to the basement. I needed to work. I needed the mechanical, logical rhythm of gears and springs. I sat at my bench and began to disassemble the Seth Thomas clock I'd used as a Trojan horse. As I unscrewed the brass movements, my fingers brushed against something that didn't belong. In my business, you learn the weight of every component. This clock felt a fraction of an ounce, too heavy toward the rear of the casing. I turned the clock over, examining the mahogany backboard. There, tucked behind the chime rod assembly, was a tiny, pressurized compartment something Daniel must have added when he helped me move it months ago. Using a pair of precision pliers, I pried the compartment open. A small, encrypted USB drive fell out, along with a handwritten note on a slip of yellow legal pad. My breath hitched as I recognized the handwriting. It wasn't Daniel's. It was Jessica's. "Daniel, the Atlantic City guys are tracking the wire transfers. If the FBI moves in before the Pine Haven transfer is complete, this is our insurance. The ledger on this drive proves the syndicate's offshore holdings. If they come for us, we give them this, and tell them the FBI already has a copy scheduled for release. They won't touch us if they think we're a dead man's switch." I stared at the drive. This wasn't just a ledger. This was a death warrant. Jessica hadn't just been a willing participant. She had been the strategist. She had built a blackmail file against a violent criminal organization, thinking she was smart enough to play both sides of the board. She had used my house, my basement, to hide the one thing that would make the syndicate hunt her to the ends of the earth. Suddenly, the front door of the house, the one with the brand new, reinforced locks vibrated with a heavy, rhythmic pounding. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I reached for the radio Patrick had given me, but before my fingers could close around it, the pounding stopped. Then came the sound of a key turning. Not a forced entry, a key. I had changed the locks. Patrick had the only other set. Unless... "Dad?" The voice was a ragged, terrified sob. It echoed down the basement stairs, raw and trembling. "Dad, please, I know you're down there. Please, open the door." It was Jessica. I stood up, the USB drive clutched in my palm. I walked to the bottom of the stairs and looked up. She was standing at the top of the landing, illuminated by the dim kitchen light. She looked like a ghost. Her expensive trench coat was torn at the shoulder, her face was bruised, and her eyes were wide with a level of primal terror I had never seen in a human being. "How did you get in, Jessica?" I asked, my voice as cold as the frost on the windows. The emergency key." She gasped, her chest heaving. "The one you hid inside the fake rock by the garden shed 20 years ago. You never moved it, Dad. I remembered. She stumbled down the stairs, collapsing at my feet, her hands grabbing the hem of my trousers. She was shaking so violently I could hear her teeth chattering. "They're outside, Dad," she whimpered, her voice barely a whisper. "The Atlantic City men. They followed me from the motel. They know Daniel is talking to the feds. They think I have the ledger. They told me if I didn't give it to them by midnight, they'd burn me alive. Please, Dad, I have nowhere else to go. You have to save me." I looked down at her. This was the woman who 48 hours ago was prepared to watch me be lobotomized for a paycheck. This was the woman who had laughed about my senility while drinking my wine. "I don't have to do anything, Jessica," I said. "They're going to kill me," she shrieked, her fingers digging into my shins. "I'm your daughter. I'm your little girl." "My little girl died the moment she signed those papers at Pine Haven," I said. I held up the small USB drive. "Is this what they're looking for? The insurance you were so proud of?" She saw the drive and let out a strangled cry, reaching for it. But I stepped back. "Give it to me, Dad. If I give it to them, they'll leave. I'll go away. I'll never bother you again. I'll disappear. Just let me live." I looked past her, toward the small basement window at ground level. In the darkness of the driveway, I saw the silhouette of a black SUV idling, its headlights off. Two shadows emerged from the vehicle, moving with a heavy, purposeful gait. They didn't have badges. They didn't have warrants. I realized then that the reversal wasn't over. The collapse was still happening. "You brought them to my house," I said, the realization hitting me with a fresh wave of fury. "You didn't come here for help. You came here to lead them to the drive. You were going to let them burst in here, let them do whatever they wanted to me, just so you could hand them this and walk away clean." "No," she lied, but the way her eyes darted to the drive told me everything. "I just didn't know where else to go. I'm scared, Dad." The front door above us didn't explode this time. Instead, there was a soft, metallic click, the sound of a professional bypass tool. The syndicate didn't kick doors, they walked through them. I heard the heavy, deliberate footsteps on the floorboards above. 2 men, maybe 3. They weren't rushing. They knew she was trapped. They knew I was an old man. Jessica scrambled backward, hiding behind my workbench, her eyes fixed on the stairs. "Hide me, Dad. Put me in the crawl space, please." I looked at the USB drive in my hand, then at the radio on the bench, and finally at the woman who shared my DNA but none of my soul. What happened next was the hardest decision of my life, but as a fire inspector, I knew that sometimes, to save the rest of the block, you have to let the primary structure burn to the ground. I didn't pick up the radio. I didn't call Patrick. I didn't hide Jessica. Instead, I walked over to the heavy iron wood-burning stove I used to heat the workshop in the winter. I opened the door, seeing the glowing embers of the fire I'd started an hour ago. "What are you doing?" Jessica hissed. I dropped the USB drive into the center of the coals. I watched the plastic melt and the silicon chips sizzle and pop, turning the syndicate's secrets into useless, black sludge. "Now nobody has the ledger, Jessica," I said, turning back to her. "And the men upstairs are coming down to ask you where it is." The first heavy boot stepped onto the top basement stair. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist in this story wasn't about who went to jail or who got the money. It was about what a man is willing to do to ensure that justice isn't just served, but felt in every bone of the person who betrayed him. "Dad, please," Jessica sobbed, realizing I had just destroyed her only bargaining chip. I sat back down in my work chair, picked up a jeweler's loupe, and began to examine a tiny brass gear. I didn't look at the stairs. I didn't look at her. "You should have drank the tea, Jessie," I whispered. "It makes the end so much easier." The heavy boots hit the bottom step with a final, echoing thud that seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the house. 2 men stepped into the dim light of my workshop. They didn't wear masks like the ones from the night of the robbery. These men didn't feel the need to hide. They had the faces of men who had long ago outsourced their consciences to the highest bidder, hard, weathered, and utterly indifferent to the terror they inspired. The one in front was tall, wearing a leather jacket that smelled of stale tobacco in the freezing night air. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the 23 clocks ticking away their final hours on my shelves. He looked straight at Jessica, who was curled into a ball behind my heavy oak workbench, her breath coming in ragged, high-pitched hitches. "Jessica," the man said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "You've had a very busy week. Daniel is running his mouth to the feds, and you're running around Philly with property that doesn't belong to you. We're tired of the track meet." "I don't have it," Jessica shrieked, her voice cracking. She pointed a trembling finger toward the wood-burning stove. "He took it. My father took it. He just threw it in the fire. He's crazy. He's senile. He didn't know what it was." The man in the leather jacket finally turned his eyes toward me. I didn't look up from the jeweler's loupe. I kept my hand steady as I adjusted a microscopic brass screw. I felt the heat of the stove at my back, the smell of melting plastic and scorched silicon still pungent in the air. "Is that right, old man?" the man asked, stepping closer. "You just burned $500 million worth of leverage because you didn't like the color of the plastic." I set the loupe down on the velvet pad. I looked him in the eye, not with the glazed stare of a victim, but with the level, clinical gaze of a man who had seen entire city blocks reduced to ash and understood exactly how heat behaves under pressure. "I didn't like what was on it," I said, my voice as dry as old parchment. "It was an accelerant, and in my experience, when you find an accelerant in a house you love, you neutralize it before the whole structure goes up." The second man, a shorter, thick-set individual with a broken nose, moved toward the stove. He grabbed a pair of my heavy fireplace tongs and yanked the door open. He poked around in the embers for a second before pulling out a blackened, distorted lump of molten junk. He dropped it onto the concrete floor with a metallic clink. It wasn't a USB drive anymore. It was a tombstone. "It's gone, Vinny," the thick-set man grunted. The man in the leather jacket, Vinny, didn't move. A terrifying stillness settled over him. He looked back at Jessica, who was now weeping openly, her face pressed against the dusty floorboards. "That was your only ticket, Jess," Vinny said softly. "The bosses were willing to let you walk if you handed over the ledger. Now you're just a witness who knows too much and has nothing to offer." He reached into the small of his back, his hand disappearing beneath the leather jacket. Jessica let out a thin, wavering howl of pure, primitive despair. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, searching for the hero she used to hand brass screws to 30 years ago. Dad, do something, please. Call Patrick, tell them you have another copy, lie to them, anything. I didn't reach for the radio. I didn't beg for her life. I just leaned back in my work chair and checked the time on my wrist. I told you once, Jessica, I said, my voice cutting through her hysterics. You have to pay attention to the patterns. You were so focused on the drive that you forgot who you were dealing with. You thought I was a mark. You thought I was a burden. But I've spent 38 years working for the city of Philadelphia. I know how the departments talk to each other. Vinny paused, his hand still on the grip of his weapon. What are you talking about, Pops? My son is FBI, I said, tilting my head toward the stairs. But my old captain? He's the deputy commissioner of the Philly PD now. And Patrick isn't the only one who has this house under surveillance. I reached under my workbench and flipped a small industrial toggle switch. Suddenly, the basement wasn't dim anymore. A set of high-intensity, industrial floodlights I'd installed for detailed restoration work flickered to life, blinding the two men. At the same instant, the heavy, reinforced steel door at the top of the basement stairs, the one I'd had installed while Jessica was busy planning her Miami condo, slammed shut with a hydraulic hiss, the electronic deadbolts engaging with a sound like a guillotine. What the? Vinny shouted, shielding his eyes. This workshop is a bunker, I said, standing up. Fire rated for 4 hours, reinforced concrete, soundproofed. And the moment I flipped that switch, a silent alarm went directly to the precinct 4 blocks away. They aren't 5 minutes away, Vinny. They were waiting in the alley for the moment you stepped through the front door. The sound of heavy, rhythmic thudding started above us. It wasn't the measured steps of the syndicate. It was the synchronized boots of a SWAT entry team. Flashbangs detonated in the living room, the muffled boom 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 vibrating through the ceiling. Vinny spun around, aiming his gun at the steel door, but he knew he was trapped in a cage of my making. He looked at me, then at the sobbing woman on the floor, and finally at the clocks. You set us up, he hissed. No, I corrected him. Jessica set you up. She brought you to a fire inspector's house and expected me not to notice the smell of smoke. She gave you the key. She gave you the location. She's the one who led you into a windowless concrete box with a federal agent's father. The steel door at the top of the stairs didn't blow open. It was opened from the outside with a master code. Patrick led the team down, his shield out, his weapon light cutting through the glare of my shop lamps. Drop it, FBI. Get on the ground. Now. It was over in seconds. Vinny and the thick-set man were tackled, disarmed, and cuffed. They didn't fight. They knew the math. They were caught inside a residence with a kidnapped woman and an elderly man, armed and dangerous. But as the agents hauled the men away, the room fell into a jagged, uncomfortable silence. Jessica remained on the floor. She wasn't being rescued. 2 officers stepped toward her, and for a moment, I saw her reach out her hands, expecting to be helped up. Instead, the officer reached for his belt. Clack, clack. The handcuffs snapped around her wrists. What? Jessica gasped, looking up at the officer, then at Patrick. Patrick, what are you doing? I'm the victim. They were going to kill me. Dad, tell them. Patrick wouldn't look at her. He kept his eyes on his notepad, his jaw set so tight I thought his teeth might crack. Jessica Bernie Harris. The officer recited the words with a cold, robotic neutrality. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, solicitation of a violent felony, and multiple counts of financial exploitation of the elderly. Conspiracy to commit murder? Jessica screamed, struggling as they pulled her to her feet. I didn't try to kill anyone. I was hiding. We found your second phone, Jess, Patrick said, finally looking at her. His eyes were full of a weary, profound sadness. The one you used to call Vinny's bosses 40 minutes ago. We have the logs. You didn't come here because you were scared. You came here because you told them the old man had the ledger and wouldn't give it up. You told them to come handle him so you could take the drive and flee. You traded Dad's life for your own exit strategy. The air seemed to leave Jessica's lungs. She looked at me, and for the first time in this entire nightmare, the mask was gone. There was no sweet daughter, no calculating strategist, no terrified victim. There was just a hollow, broken person who had gambled her soul and lost. Dad, she whispered. I didn't answer. I turned back to my workbench. I picked up the 1,800 pocket watch, the one I'd finally fixed. I wound it slowly, listening to the rhythmic, healthy tick of the gears. Take her out, Patrick said quietly. I listened to her boots on the stairs. I listened to her screams turn into muffled sobs. And then finally, I heard the sound of the squad car doors slamming shut in the driveway. One by one, the engines started, and the sirens faded into the distance, leaving me alone in the basement with my clocks. Patrick stayed behind for a while. He didn't say much. He just sat on the old couch, the one where Jessica used to nap when she was 10, and watched me work. "You okay, Dad?" he asked eventually. The timing was off on the Seth Thomas, I said, gesturing to the melted lump on the floor. "But the foundation is still solid. I'll have to replace the backboard, but the heart of it is fine." Patrick stood up and squeezed my shoulder. "She's going away for a long time, Dad. The syndicate guys are going to flip on her to save themselves. And Daniel, well, Daniel is already naming names. It's over." "It was over a long time ago, Patrick," I said. "We just finally caught up to the clock." After he left, I walked through the house. It was empty now. Truly empty. I went into the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea, real tea, from a box I'd bought myself. I sat at the table and watched the sun begin to bleed over the Philadelphia skyline. I'm 67 years old. I've lost my wife to cancer and my daughter to greed. My life savings are tied up in a legal battle that will take years to untangle. And the house I raised my family in feels like a museum of things that went wrong. But as I sat there, I realized I could feel my fingers again. The tremors were gone. The fog in my brain had lifted. I wasn't the old man they wanted me to be. I was Chester Burney. And I had walked through the fire and come out the other side without smelling like smoke. A few months later, I sold the house. I couldn't stand the way the hallway cameras, even though they were gone, seemed to watch me. I moved into a small apartment near the park. I only took my tools and my 23 clocks. I don't hear from Jessica. Patrick tells me she's in a women's correctional facility in the center of the state. She sends letters sometimes, but I don't open them. I don't need to read her explanations or her apologies. In my line of work, you learn that once a structure has reached a certain point of internal combustion, it's totaled. There's no rebuilding. You just clear the lot and start over. Sometimes, late at night, when the city is quiet, I sit in my new workshop and listen to the ticking. People think clocks are just about telling you when to eat or when to sleep, but they're not. They're a reminder that time is the only thing you can't steal. You can forge a deed, you can drain a bank account, and you can lie to a judge, but you can't trick the seconds. They march on, indifferent to your greed, waiting for the moment the pendulum finally swings back. Daniel and Jessica thought they could control my time. They thought they could fast forward me to the end. But they forgot that I'm the one who knows how the gears work. I picked up the 1895 pocket watch from my nightstand and checked the time. It was perfectly in sync with the world. I wound it one last time, tucked it into my pocket, and walked out into the morning sun. I had a lot of life left to live, and for the first time in a year, I wasn't wasting a single second of it. After all, the best revenge isn't seeing them behind bars. It's standing in the light they tried to dim, perfectly sane, perfectly whole, and knowing that while they are counting days in a cell, I'm the one who still owns the hours.